We're on 3:21, 38 and 39. Wow. The clock is way wrong today. Oh, is it? I guess I'm looking at it wrong. Okay. Yeah, I guess it's all right. Hare Krishna. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janaballabha Giri Bardari Yasoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Banachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Om Vishnupad Paramhamsa Paravajakacharya Dotara Satashi Śrimad Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki, Grantharaj Śrimad Bhāgavatam Ki, Sambheda Bhaktivinoda Ki, Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the Assembled Devotees. All glories to the Assembled Devotees. All glories to the Assembled Devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Ghananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Anmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swaha Padantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalitam Shri Vishakanvitam Scha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare. Hi, Hare Krishna. So, today we are on Canto 3, Chapter 21, texts 38 and 39. Yasmin Bhagavato Netran Nyapatan Ashrubindavaha Kripaya Samparitasya Prapaner Pitaya Brisham Prapaner Pitaya Brisham Tadvaibindasaro Nama Sarasvatya Pariplutam Punyam Shivamritam Jalam Maharshi Ganasevitam Yasman Bhagavato Netran Nyapatan Ashru Bindavaha Kripaya Samparitasya Prapaner Pitaya Brsham Tadvai Bindu Saro Nama Sarasvatya pariplutam punyam shivamritam jalam Maharshi Gana Sevitam Yasmin Bhagavato Netran Nyapatan Ashubindava Kripaya Samparitasya Prapanner Pityabrasham Tadvai Bindu Saro Nama Sarasvatya Pariplutam Punyam Shivamritam Jalam Maharshi Gana Sevitam Yasmin Bhagavato Netran Nyapatan Ashubindavaha Kripaya Samparitasya Prapanner Prityabrasham Tadvai Binda Saro Nama Sarasvatya Pariplutam Punyam Shivamritam Jalam Maharshi Gana Sevitam. Vaishnavis. Yasmin Bhagavato Netran Nyapatan Ashubindavaha Kripaya Samparitasya Prapaner Pityabrasham Tadvai Binda Saro Nama Sarasvatya Pariplutam Punyam Shivamritam Jalam Maharshi Gana Sevitam Yasmin, in which Bhagavatam of the Lord Netrat, from the eye, Nyapatan, fell down, Ashubindavaha, teardrops, Kripaya, by compassion, Samparitasya, who was overwhelmed, Prapanne, on the surrendered soul Karma, Arpitaya, placed upon, Brusham, extremely, Tat, that, Vai, indeed, Bindusara, lake of tears, Nama, called, Sarasvatya, by the river Sarasvati, Pariplutam, overflowed, Punyam, holy, Shiva, auspicious, Amrita, nectar, Jalam, water, Maharshi, of the great sages, Gana, by hosts, Sevitam, served. So here's the translation. The holy lake Bindu Sarovara, flooded by the waters of the river Sarasvati, was resorted to by hosts of eminent sages. Its holy water was not only auspicious, but as sweet as nectar. It was called Bindu Sarovara because drops of tears had fallen there from the eyes of the Lord, who was overwhelmed by extreme compassion for the sage who had sought his protection. So we can responsively recite the English. The holy lake Bindu Sarovara, flooded by the waters of the river Sarasvati, was resorted to by hosts of eminent sages. Its holy water was not only auspicious, but as sweet as nectar. It was called Bindu Sarovara because drops of tears had fallen there from the eyes of the Lord, who was overwhelmed by extreme compassion for the sage who had sought his protection. Oh, here's our purport by Srila Prabhupada. Kardam underwent austerities to gain the causeless mercy of the Lord. And when the Lord arrived there, he was so compassionate that in pleasure he shed tears, which became Bindu Sarovara. Bindu Sarovara, therefore, is worshipped by great sages and learned scholars because, according to the philosophy of the Absolute Truth, the Lord and the tears from his eyes are not different. Just as the drops of perspiration which fell from the toe of the Lord became the sacred Ganges, so the teardrops from the transcendental eyes of the Lord became Bindu Sarovara. Both are transcendental entities and are worshipped by great sages and scholars. The water of Bindu Sarovara is described here as Shivamrita Jal. Shiva means curing. Anyone who drinks the water of Bindu Sarovara is cured of all material diseases. Similarly, anyone who takes bath in the Ganges is also relieved of all material diseases. These claims are accepted by great scholars and authorities and are still being acted upon even in this fallen age of Kali. Yasmin Bhagavato Netran Nyapatan Ashru Bindavaha Kripaya Samparitasya Prapanir Pitaya Brisham Tadvai Bindusaro Nama Sarasvatya Pariplutam Punyam Shivamritam Jalam Maharshi Ganasevitam. The holy lake Bindu Sarovara, flooded by the waters of the river Sarasvati, was resorted to by hosts of eminent sages. Its holy water was not only auspicious, but as sweet as nectar. It was called Bindu Sarovara because drops of tears had fallen there from the eyes of the Lord, who was overwhelmed by extreme compassion for the sage who had sought his protection. We are beginning a section here in Śrimad Bhāgavatam where we're going to hear luscious descriptions of the area where this is all taking place, the Bindu Sarovara. And in general, it's interesting that in many places in Śrimad Bhāgavatam, there are these elaborate descriptions. They are simply word descriptions of a particular location. And this is interesting, that why in a philosophical book would we get into detail about how a place looked or what was going on there. In other words, we're seeing an entire visual diorama being depicted in words before our reading eyes. And this is interesting. One thing that's interesting about it is that we notice that things that have to do with spiritual life, things that have to do with purity, things that have to do with the process of Krishna consciousness, they are attractive in a number of ways. When we come into the temple, we expect to see flowers and colors. We expect to see gorgeous clothing. We expect to see nice sounds. Of course, these days, incense is kind of conspicuous by its funkiness. That most of the incense that we seem to find ourselves using in the modern age is just kind of glorified, smoke makers. It doesn't have much odor to it. doesn't have a nice flavor. Once in a while, you get a packet of incense that smells like something. But at any rate, that's kind of an aside. I don't want to get lost in that. What we recognize is that spiritual life and those things which are associated with the Lord are attractive. They're attractive visually, they're attractive by the smell, they're attractive by the way they sound, they're attractive in the way they touch or feel, they're attractive in the way that they even taste, because we have the prasadam of the Lord, the various foodstuffs offered to the Supreme. These things are given to us, and they are also attractive in smell and attractive in taste. We can contrast this to the things in the material world. Immediately when we go outside New York City, we see dirty things. We see broken things. We see things that are disgusting and smelly. We have, of course, a place like Brooklyn, many instances of what is known in our modern vernacular as pavement pizzas. So this is the nature of the world around us. And people often find themselves very attracted to mundane places like bars and places where people congregate. But if you go into a bar, the first thing you notice is this horrible smell. We've all probably at one time or another, at least many of us who grew up in the West, have experienced what it smells like when you first walk into a bar. There's this really creepy sort of, partly alcohol, partly, insides of people's stomachs and things like that that have been regurgitated in various places, and it's very creepy. Things are dark and awful in many ways. So in this way, we can see that even our senses are telling us something about spiritual life. And today I kind of wanted to talk about that because, interestingly enough, I've been listening to a very remarkable group of lectures done by a devotee named Akundati. He does something that's called the Atma paradigm. And he's describing something that is so basic and so simple, yet when you look at it closely, it becomes very mysterious. There's a word that maybe some of you have heard. So the word is qualia. Have anybody here in this room ever heard this word qualia before? Qualia. 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 It's a Latin word, but it wasn't used by the Latins. It was used by someone named C.S. Pierce, who first brought it into vernacular in the 1800s, 1866 or thereabouts. This is a strange and mysterious sounding word, but it's a word for the least strange thing that you could ever possibly want to understand, and that is the sensory experience that we have. That's what it means. Qualia means the sensory experience that we have. Like here, we're hearing words like sweet, and we'll be hearing later about how there were various flora and fauna, various birds there. We're going to hear all these kinds of things and the colors involved and so on and so forth. So when we talk about a color, like we have all these festoons hanging overhead, and some of them are green, some of them are red, some of them are yellow. We would never mistake a yellow one for a green one or a red one. And what is this? This color we call red. Now, all along we've grown up in a so-called scientifically literate society. And we understand that there's light, These light photons are bouncing off, and a plastic sheet that is red in color means it reflects the red color and absorbs the others, and those colors go into our eyes, and then they are turned into electrical impulses that are shot along our optic nerve. The rods and cones fire in such and such a way, and then this disappears into the brain. And this all sounds fairly reasonable, and it sounds fairly complete, and this is the story we've grown up with. But if you actually investigate modern science, which is trying to get a bigger hold on this, a better grasp on what's happening, we realize that this picture falls apart. The first place it falls apart is that when we have these rods and cones firing and the optic nerve disappears into something called the Brodmann's area 17 in the back of the brain, where visual activity is processed. Where is the picture? We have electrical pulses we hear, ions that are going from axons to dendrites in the optic nerve. But where is the picture, and who's watching it? That's the mysterious part. There's no explanation of that. So we use this analogy. We have cameras. I'm using one right now, and we have recording devices. The camera is recording various bits of information and storing them in a digital format as ones and zeros. And so it's storing them as ones and zeros, and then later on they will be processed in some kind of way upstairs. They'll be recorded as ones and zeros in a magnetic or electrical substrate of some kind or another. But still, at some point, somebody has to watch the video. If we have just a video file, it can have, it can be anything, video file. It's all these ones and zeros. As long as it stays that way, we can't enjoy it, we can't experience it. It's just coded into a format that our senses don't appreciate. Now, similarly, this same analogy is there, that we have electrical impulses going into the brain, and they correspond, or at least we're told, they correspond to visual stimuli, like brightness, color, shape, location, all these kinds of things. But then we also have auditory information going into the brain, also in electrical pulses. But we usually don't confuse audio information with visual information. They're very different. So where in the brain do electrical impulses turn into sound? Where do they turn into a visual picture? Where? Nobody knows the answer to that. There's no answer to that. And so this is a very strange thing. And there's another strange thing that we're hearing, we're seeing, and when I look out, I see you, and you appear to be over there, and you appear to be over there. But supposedly all this is happening in the back of my brain as electrical pulses. Why does it appear that you appear out there rather than in here? And so therefore, this very simple thing, qualia, the experiences of the senses, it's not just visual. That qualia refers to the way things smell, the way they look, the way they sound, the way they hear. We are given this paradigm, or we could say this metaphor, because we have cameras and computers, so we think about things in terms of bits, we think about things in electrical impulses, and we have cameras and recording devices that record these things. And we assume that our sensory experience must be something like this. But the more it's studied by science, the more we realize that this doesn't work exactly, that there are serious problems here. And Akundati, he makes mention of several of the more mysterious aspects that probably you and I have never thought about before. That one of them he calls the sparseness problem. This is what people who try to understand what the brain is doing. Mostly in our modern world, we have this totally material conception that the brain's doing everything. That it's just like we have a computer and we play files on it. There was a researcher, Francis Crick, the same one who discovered the DNA helix. He wanted to investigate the process of the brain. How does it actually work? How does it produce consciousness? So he and another researcher investigated a series of things called the neural correlates of consciousness, NCC. So their theory is that these pulses correlate to experiences. But still, he even realized that there's big gaps here. Where does the thing actually turn into a picture? Who's watching the picture? So, and the picture appears to be out there. The sound appears to be out there, not in here. So, essentially, if we look at the way that it's been described so far, there should be a little Chandra Sekhar Swami in the back of all of your brains somewhere, doing something or another. But it doesn't look like I'm in the back of your brain. It looks like I'm out here in the world. Now, Akundati goes further, and he describes more problems with this mechanistic view of the brain and of qualia, or sense experience. He explains that there are something like 10 billion photons entering your eyes from, the outside world. So that's a huge number. Now, how many rods and cones do we have in the back of our eyeballs? Turns out, not so many. So by the time we start talking about the light photons interacting with the rods and cones, we realize that even when a rod or a cone reacts, it needs a resting period. So it fires off because it actually connected with a photon. Then it has to rest for a little bit of time. So this also diminishes. And then by the time it gets into the Brodmann's area in the back of the mind, in the back of the brain rather, it's diminished down to where the scientists who are studying these phenomena say that we are processing something like 500 pixels, which I don't know if not pixels, 500 bits of information, which is like 20 pixels. We shouldn't be seeing anything that resembles a very detailed image. We should be seeing something that's very, very crude. But we're not. We see what appears to be a very detailed image. And this is called the sparseness problem. And there's a similar thing going on with sound vibration, that somehow or other, if we just talk about electrical impulses going down either the optic nerve or disappearing into the brain from the ear, that we should be seeing things in a very, very crude way. We shouldn't see the detail that we see now. And this problem in neuroscience is called the sparseness problem. So Akundati talks about that. But there's other problems. One of them is the problem of synchronizing. That if I clap, it looks to you like when my hands came together, the sound happened. We know that if we do this and you're far enough away from me, it will look like when my hands come together and the sound hits your ears. It won't be exactly at the same time. But you all are pretty close. So when I clap, it looks as if, to most of you, that when my hands come together, that's when the sound happens. But it shouldn't be like that. Because the nerve endings in our brain and in our sense organs, they process things at a fairly slow rate, at something like, I think Akundati was saying something like 280 miles an hour, which sounds fast, but it's not really that fast. When I do video editing, I know that if the video and the audio don't line up, it bothers you, you know. And so a visual image is much more intricate than an audio image. So it takes much more time to process a video image than it takes to process an audio image. So essentially, we should be experiencing audio and visual images out of sync all the time. Unless either A, there's two possibilities. One of them, the neuroscientists have discovered, or this is one postulate that they have. One of the things that's possible is that for some reason, the brain slows down the audio image so that it gets released at the same time that the video image is, so they appear to be synced up. But this means then that we would be experiencing the whole world with a time delay, which doesn't appear to be the way we actually experience the world. The other possible thing is that the brain just makes it up, that we don't have the visual image yet, so the brain makes up one just so that it can be in time with the audio image, which also doesn't sound realistic. Now, where this would make a big difference is in sports, because, you know, somebody is playing cricket or basketball or playing baseball. These things, the balls move at incredible rates of speed. And according to the slow processing of our sensory information, it should not be possible for a batter to see a ball coming towards him and be able to make adjustments to hit that ball, because the pitcher is trying to throw a curve or something like that. And in a similar way, whatever we're doing, whether we're balancing on a rope or whatever we're engaging in, it requires split-second timing, which essentially our brains can't do in real time. But we do it. So how is that possible? How is it possible that we can deal with things in real time? And of course, there are more problems. But what I'm bringing up here is the fact that even simple sensory experiences are not what we think they are. And Akundati gets into a whole explanation of it, which he calls the Atma paradigm. I don't have time to get into it, but it's fascinating if you're interested. But he explains these things, and then we begin to realize that the world we live in is much stranger than we think it is, and that somehow or other we experience things, but it's not exactly and completely through the senses, and it certainly has something to do with the brain, but the brain can't be held accountable for all the information and how that information is being uploaded to our consciousness. And then there's no explanation for the person viewing, what we call the seer, or the actual soul, the experiencer of the visual, the audio, the smells, the tastes, and everything in the world around us. So, our material world is designed in a way that it appears as though we are bodies. It appears as though we are seeing an external world, and that external world is being given to us only by the process of our senses. But this is not what's happening, even according to neuroscience, that there's something more to this process. Now, they haven't figured out what it is, and their explanation of it is got a lot of serious problems, because in modern scientific thinking, everything has to be based on just material explanations. But if we think about things from a spiritual point of view, then we're not held accountable to this very limited way of explaining the world around us. Now, as we've been talking about, the beautiful arrangements that we see in a place like Bindu Sarovara, these beautiful, what we're going to learn about, beautiful birds and waters and peacefulness, all these things are conducive to a consciousness. And so therefore, to engage in spiritual life, if we attempt to do it in a peaceful place, then it will be easier to perform. Of course, we can engage in spiritual life anywhere if we're forced to, under any circumstances. But that's the benefit of undergoing a spiritual process in a place specifically designed for it. And the temple is a place specifically designed for spiritual life. And therefore, we are constantly, even on a random moment, bombarded with things that remind us of the spiritual world. We come downstairs, we hear a kirtan, even if we're not participating in the kirtan, we hear it. Sometimes we're doing something and we hear a kirtan coming in from another room, or sometimes we hear devotees talking about some spiritual principle. And in this way, the food we eat, the smells we have, the colors we see, the entire environment, even when we're spacing out, the environment is helping us to refocus on, the spiritual domain. So, as we see, the process of spiritual life is generally attractive to the senses. Even people who would normally be totally disinterested in spiritual life, most of them would still find the aspects of spiritual life more physically attractive than they would find the elements of material life. So this is the nature of how, through the senses, through use of the senses, we are learning how to focus on Krishna. So sometimes we say Krishna consciousness is mind control, and sometimes we say it's sense control. Both things are exactly the same thing, because if we control the mind, that means we're directing the senses in the proper way. If we're directing the senses in the proper way, that means our mind is controlled. Both things are essentially the same thing. So I want to leave some time for questions and comment. Do we have our microphone?
Hare Krishna Prabhu, please accept my humble obeisances, and thanks for the nice class. It was pretty interesting. I have a few questions / comments. One, I'm wondering about dreams, because you talked about how we don't experience you in the back of our head, but when we sleep, it's almost like we create a whole field of activity by the subtle body. And then I also want to just ask about, I don't know if you really said it, but time dilation. Like, I used to race motocross, and if you play sports like with the ball coming at you fast, as you get used to things, your eyes adjust over time and it slows things down. And also, if there's danger, you can actually experience a whole lot in 2 seconds.
Right,
So the
right.
time is not, I don't know what it is, if it's relative or.
Yeah, what this shows is that there's more going on than the material model. The material model of senses getting outside photons or pressure waves from the air and processing them, and we call that sound, we call that vision. There's more to it than that. And Akundati actually starts to describe that, and what he's describing is actually fascinating because I've never thought about the material world in that way, but he describes that there is, what we call the tanmatras, that they are subtle sense data, and it's out there. And I don't have time to really elaborately get into it, but we are experiencing things directly to some extent. That's how it's possible to deal with the outside world in real time, which according to the way material energy works, it should not be possible. Now, in regard to your question about dreams, there's a lot of things going on there. Most of the times, according to the Vedic system, dreams are sometimes us fusing together images from two different places. Prabhupada says there's gold and there's a mountain. We put them together and create a golden mountain. So we're fusing things together. And this is another place where Akundati talks about something called the pool of the mind, which is discussed in various parts of the Vedic literature, that the pool has something on the surface, but it also has things deep below. Sometimes things bubble up from lower realms of the pool, things that we're normally not able to see. And so when we really start thinking about how the Vedic explanation of sense experience is, it becomes much more complex than we usually realize. So with dreams also, we can be processing memories, a lot of other different things can be happening. So I don't know, there's too much more to be said about that.
So is the mind and intelligence, are they both situated in the heart, not the brain? And then
Yeah, generally that's the way it's described, that the consciousness is in the heart, and the consciousness experiences the what we've been talking about as qualia, the sense data that come in, and they come in to some extent directly. And Akundati talks about a phenomenon that he himself was involved with called remote viewing. And in the United States, there was a effort by the CIA to be aware of what might be going on in foreign countries, particularly at that time in Russia with the Cold War going on. So they heard that in Russia people were studying this phenomenon known as remote viewing, so the U.S. had to get involved in it too. There were a couple of researchers, Harold Puthoff and some others, who were studying this phenomenon, and what it amounts to is that, and the way Akundati describes it, he says that it doesn't require special people. You don't have to have some psychic ability or something, but quite ordinary people can do this. And they're given a target, and simply by relaxing and meditating, people can be asked to describe something going on somewhere else in the world usually very remote, maybe hundreds of miles away. And they can draw a picture of it, they can give accurate explanation of how it is, what it works, what it sounds like, et cetera, et cetera. And this should be impossible by scientific means, but it does show that to some extent the senses can, or the mind or the self can directly come in contact with the information of the world around us without being brokered through the senses. And this starts to explain how it is that we can deal with things in real time and how we see things out there, even though they appear to be electrical images going on in the back of our brain and other things. So anyway, again, there's much more there than I'm explaining right now, but that's as far as I can get in this.
Lastly, I'll say I'm wondering that besides us all having essentially the same facilities, senses, mind, all the same elements, the supersoul is located within every atom and with everyone's heart, and Krishna is the doer. So wouldn't that be the synchronicity?
Well, that's there too.
Because
the super soul is allowing us to, Krishna says that from me come knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness, that sarvasya chaham hridi sanivishto matasmritu jnanam apohanam cha. So sometimes people notice things, sometimes they don't. And it appears to us that we are experiencing a real world out there. It appears to us we are experiencing a real world in real time. And evidently, that's the way it really is. But this can't be explained with the modern, materialistic explanation that we usually hear in science books and in biology texts, that this can't be explained using those explanations. So there's something more going on. And the Supreme Lord is allowing us to experience some things and not others. And depending on our spiritual focus, our desires, is what particularly we experience and what we don't. Because as he talks about, this pool of the mind has a focus. So there's some things we're focused on and some things we're not focused on. And for those things we're not focused on, they might not as well exist. Like right now, most of you have probably not thought about your left leg in the last 10 seconds. But when I mention it, suddenly you recognize that you have a left leg and that there's something coming in from it, maybe nothing particularly earth-shattering. But when we're doing something, our consciousness is focused on some things, and the other things are as good as if they didn't exist, because we are not focused on them. And this is what spiritual life is all about, learning how to bring that focus to the right things and away from the wrong things. And this has something to do with what's called the pool of the mind. And sense perception, according to the Vedic explanation, is called pratyaya. He uses that word. So I haven't heard how Akandati describes pratyaya exactly, but this has it is how we experience the outside world. And it's interesting that Krishna in Bhagavad Gita uses the same kind of terminology. He says that I am the taste of water. So we are being, in Bhagavad Gita, focused on a qualia experience, the taste of water. I am the ability in man, the sound in ether. He says so many different things, and these are all various kinds of sense experiences. So this is very basic to human beings. We all have experiences, and there's no way to know whether the experiences you have are comparable to the ones I have. We assume they are because the way we talk about things, but there's no way to prove it. And essentially, that's all we really know. is our experiences. And so this strange word, qualia, is a word for the one thing that humans actually do know and have a tangible grasp on. Everything else is guesswork. But it's a funny word, but if we understand it, then we can recognize something about the strange way in which the material world works and how to better control our senses and focus them. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah.
I really appreciated this class. That's kind of like how I came into Krishna consciousness in the first place. I was really frustrated. Psychology didn't provide an answer to consciousness. So first I wanted to give a comment on, there's also something called, visual filling or audio filling. And so the brain will hear something where it'll see something, but it's not a complete thing. And so still it's somehow putting the image together. So so they'll put like lines, for example, and then like it looks like a triangle because they're put in a certain way, but they're just lines.
Right.
So they don't have an answer for how like it's actually being put together, because if it's just electrical signals, then we should just see 3 lines. So that's another interesting thing about it can't just be, consciousness can't be existing in the mind. And also I had a question. Fred here asked about like where mind and intelligence are residing. He said mind and intelligence resides in the heart, and you said yes to that. And I was a little curious if you could elaborate on that a little more, because to my understanding it's more of they're residing in the subtle body. So how is like...
Well, that's where the subtle body is situated.
Okay.
We hear that the two things. We hear that consciousness is spread throughout the body, according to the Vedic literatures, based on the life airs. So the life airs circulate the consciousness throughout the whole body. We also hear that it's based on the blood. So we know, for instance, that if you put a tourniquet on your arm, eventually the hand will cease to feel. So there is this idea that we are just a particle, and that's the soul. But the soul is housed within something we call the subtle body. And the subtle body, through the agency of the life airs, is connected to the gross body, this thing. And at the time of death, the subtle body leaves the gross body behind, and therefore all contact with the gross body is broken at that point permanently, that we no longer will experience what comes in from these eyes, what comes in from this nose. And this is something that is worth meditating on, because if you start to think that way, you start to really, it's a different way to grasp the fact that you're not the body. Because at some point, everything in your present perspective will be jerked out from under you. What the body is, how it hears, where it's located, what history is assigned to it, what gender it is, all these things will suddenly just disappear. And you will be realized as a subtle body, or as time goes on, you will dissolve the subtle body, which is what Kapila Dev will tell his mother, that the process of Krishna consciousness dissolves the subtle body. And when the subtle body is completely dissolved, then there is no reason to have another gross body. And therefore the soul repatriates back to the spiritual world. Because the process of karma is the process of developing a new gross body. So as we are acting now through our karma, we are developing a future gross body. And when we die, the subtle body will take us to that future gross body. But the soul is not really connected with the body. And the soul has its own senses. And the subtle body has its own senses. So the subtle body can see even when the gross body can't. And this is done sometimes. We see that people have heart conditions, and various medical emergency personnel do whatever medical procedures are necessary to try to restart the heart. And during that time, the heart is not pumping, so therefore there's no blood going to the brain. Therefore, there should be zero electrical activity going on in the brain. Yet people during such times have what are called out-of-the-body experiences. They recognize what the doctors and nurses are doing at that time, and they can give detailed descriptions of it. And this should be totally impossible, which shows that the subtle body has its own senses, and it can perceive directly without the need of the gross senses being active. And in this case, they're not active. In a heart arrest episode, the gross senses aren't active, but still it's possible to have these experiences. So how is it possible? Therefore, there is something else going on, a direct perception by the subtle senses of the material world. And of course we have spiritual senses too, but those are directed towards the Supreme Lord. But because we are not at all tuned in to spiritual life, therefore we ignore our spiritual senses for the most part. I use the analogy of just like a kid who's playing a computer game. You know, he's focused right now on his computer. There may be something going on in the room, but he's not interested in it. His mother may be calling him saying, you know, come down and eat something, but he's not paying attention to it. He's playing a game on the computer. So his consciousness is focused on this computer's senses and not on his other senses. In a similar way, when we are engaged in material life, we are focused on the material senses and our external world perceived through them, rather than the spiritual senses, which are properly perceiving the Supreme Lord. However, if we are spiritually developed enough, we will be able to directly perceive the Supreme Lord, even in this present body. So at least that's a few more things. All right, so we're about 5 minutes over, so thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Śrimad Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.